Hi, and welcome to Section 6, where we will review other utilities used in our recipes application. In the previous section, we used methods in the Lodash string API to help format our recipe cards. We also added Lodash functions into our templates, thereby enabling the creation of more complex templates. In this section, we will start by adding a route to our API that will allow a user to log into the application, and we'll use Lodash to track the user's login time. We'll also create a login form for our front end and hide parts of the application based on the user's login status. After handling login, we'll turn our attention to recipe details, adding the date created and precise amounts for each ingredient required. We'll make updates to our API and recipe form to allow the user to add ingredients when creating a recipe. Now we move on to the first video of this section that deals with adding a user login route to our API that will also mark the timestamp of a user's login. In this video, we are going to take a look at how we can log a user into the application using basic HTTP authentication. We'll review express middleware used to parse a basic auth header and validate a client auth token. We'll then write the internals of the login route for our API, generating a token and timestamp for the user upon successful login. We'll use Lodash to retrieve the user from our data store and generate a timestamp for their login. We'll wrap up the video by testing the login route we created. Before we get started, let's make sure we have the most recent code checked out. From the command line, go to your Recipes API repo and run git checkout video-6-1. This will get you the latest code you need to follow along with the video. After you check out the branch, you'll need to run npm install to install a third-party package added for this video. We'll be working in the Recipes API repo to create a route to log the user into the application, but first let's review how we are going to handle authentication. In your code editor, open up app/utils/auth.js. This module defines two functions for managing authentication in our Express API. The first function manages validating the contents of a basic HTTP authorization header with the help of a node module we added to our dependencies called basic auth. The basic auth module will parse the base64 encoded auth header and extract from it both name and pass properties. We use those to search for a user in the data store using the Lodash find method, passing the username that we would like to validate. If we find a user in the store and the stored password matches what was in the encoded header, the middleware will assign the user to the request object and then delegate to the route by calling next. If we cannot find a user or if the passwords don't match, we set a www authenticate header and return an HTTP status of 401 for unauthorized access. The second function will handle validating a token that our login route will provide to the client. It validates the token by checking the data store for a matching user. As we did with the basic auth middleware function, we use the Lodash find method, passing the token that we extracted from the HTTP authorization header. If we are able to get a token from the header and find a user for that token, the middleware will assign the user to the request object and then delegate to the route by calling next. If there is no token provided, or if there is no user for that token, we return an HTTP status of 401 for unauthorized access. Now that you've seen the functions our API will use to validate users, let's build the route that will log the user into an application and provide them a new token. Open the login route file at routes/login/index.js. This route will need to generate both a token for the client and a timestamp for the login. We'll use that timestamp later on to provide a last login display for the user. Let's start by including the dependencies we'll need to create the route. We will need the auth middleware that was shown previously to validate the user's login credentials. We'll also use Lodash within our code, Node.jsondb to access our data store, and the Node.js crypto module to generate a token. The route function has been created, but we want to add in our basic auth middleware function to validate the user based on the header. We'll add this as the second parameter to the route. Start the function by creating a new instance of JSONDB and assign it to a local db variable. Next, get a list of the users in our data store by calling db.getData and assign that list to a local users variable. After we create these local variables, we'll want to create a function to reuse if we reach any error conditions within our route. Create a function called sendError that will call res.status, passing a status code of 500, and then chain that to a call to res.json, passing an object with a generic message that we were unable to log the user into the system. We'll use this method if we are unable to generate a token or if we're unable to update the data store with the generated token and login timestamp. Below this function, we'll use the Lodash findIndex method to locate the position of the user in our list of users and store it in a variable I. The findIndex method works similar to the find method, but will return the index of the element found in the array instead of the element itself. After we get the index, call a method in the crypto library called randomBytes that will generate a random data string and return that to a callback through a buffer object. We pass the desired number of bytes to generate, and the callback is our second parameter. The callback takes two parameters, an error object and a buffer object. Let's name these parameters error and buff respectively. In the callback, use an if statement to make sure we do not have an error object. If there are no errors, we'll attempt to write the token and login timestamp to the data store. To do this, we'll use another handy Lodash method called attempt. Normally, we would need to wrap a write to the data store in a try-catch block, since there are errors that can be thrown within that module. However, the attempt method abstracts that away for you and will call the provided function, returning either the function's return or any error that is caught during execution. This is accomplished through a try-catch block within the attempt method. To pass parameters to the function, you simply need to add them as additional parameters to attempt. Our first parameter will be the db.push method bound to the db context. This is the function we want to attempt calling. Our second parameter to attempt will be the /user string with the array index of the user we want to update. The third parameter is our object to update the user. Add a property to this object called lastLogin, which will be the current timestamp. Lodash has a method to generate a timestamp called now, which is an alias for the date.now method. Add another property to the object called token, and to that property we'll assign a call to buff.toString, passing hex as the parameter. This converts the buffer of random bytes generated earlier to a hexadecimal encoded string. This will close out our object to update the user. The fourth and final parameter to attempt is a Boolean flag indicating whether or not we want to overwrite existing data when we call db.push. Since we simply want to add keys to our existing data, this value should be false. Setting this flag to false indicates we want to merge this update with the existing user. When we get our return from attempt, we'll store that in a variable called ret. We need to make sure that ret is not an error object, and to do that we'll use the Lodash isError method from the Lang API. This method is able to detect different types of error objects that could be thrown during execution. Add another if statement to check if ret is not an error object, and if it is not, then we return a JSON response using res.json, passing a success value of true, a message string to say that we've created a user, and a token value that again converts our buffer object to a hexadecimal encoded string. This takes care of the happy path for this route. Now let's handle the errors. Create an else block for the current condition and call the sendError function we created earlier. This handles the failure to update the user in the database. Below the if block for the creation of the buffer, add another else block, and within that block call the sendError function. This handles the failure to generate a random token. Once you have saved the login route, go to your command line and run npm runstart to start the Express API server. We're going to test out our login route using curl, but you could also use Postman or another UI application to test the API if you'd like. We need to first get a base64 encoded username and password to send in our basic auth header, so we'll use one of the made-up users in our data store, hchavez3. You can open up your browser's DevTools and use the console to encode the string. Call window.b2a and pass the following string. This is the username and password stored in our JSON DB. Press enter and you'll get back a string which you should copy to your clipboard to add to the curl request. Now go to your command line and enter the curl command. For the authorization header value, use basic followed by the string that you just copied out of the browser console. Once you enter the command, press enter and you should see the successful response with a new token generated for the user. In this video, we covered a lot of ground in getting a login mechanism up and running for our users. We reviewed the middleware that our API uses to validate both an HTTP basic authorization header and a token authorization header that will send with requests from our client. We created a login route to generate a token for a user when they log in and also record the time that they logged in into the application. We learned about several Lodash utilities, including attempt to handle functions with possible error conditions and isError to check if a variable is an error object.